morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's webinar. My name is Sarah Brown, and I'm the Northern Ireland trustee on the board of Hourglass, and I am the chair for this morning's webinar. Just before we make a start, there's just some housekeeping points to go through. Really, I just want to advise everyone that we are recording this morning's webinar, and this will be available after the event. The webinar recording will be sent to everyone who has registered to attend this morning's webinar. And it will also, the link to the webinar will be posted on our socials and in our newsletter. And if you haven't signed up for the Hourglass newsletter, I would encourage you to do so, and also to follow us on whatever social media channel you use. And we'd be delighted if you could share the links for us, because part of what we're aiming to do is to raise awareness about the work that Hourglass is doing. So please feel free to share and to post any comments that you might have. After the webinar, you will be sent a very short SurveyMonkey evaluation, and I would encourage you to please complete this, because we do value your feedback in order to try to improve our webinars going forward. During the webinar, if you have any questions, please do use the chat functions, and Naeem and myself will be keeping an eye on the questions coming in. And throughout the webinar, certainly towards the end of the webinar, we will try to address any questions which have been submitted already to us or that come up during the webinar. But could I advise that if anyone has a specific personal issue, that you would contact our helpline. Hourglass have a 24/7 helpline which operates across the 4 nations. And we would hope that you would then, by contacting the helpline, get a bespoke advice and support to your particular issue. We obviously will be answering questions in a more generic way during the webinar because of confidentiality, but please do feel free after the webinar to contact our helpline. So today's webinar is marking the 18th year of World Elder Abuse Awareness Day. And that seems amazing when we know that awareness of elder abuse remains quite low, and yet we've had a day to mark awareness of elder abuse for the past 18 years. World Elder Abuse Awareness Day falls on the 15th of June every year, so that is on Saturday. But this morning on our webinar, we will be launching the Hourglass 2024 Manifesto, which outlines what we think policymakers and governments across the 4 nations should adopt to create a safer ageing society by 2050. And we're also officially launching our new campaign, Older Age, Tomorrow's Hope, or as we refer to it as the Oath. And we're asking you all to pledge your support to end the abuse of older people by 2050. It is estimated that probably around 2.7 million older people experience some form of abuse, harm, exploitation, or neglect in the UK every year. And that is a staggering figure. But it's a figure that's only going to get bigger as demographics indicate very clearly a growing older population. Yet older people's voices are often unheard, they're often left voiceless, and yet it is even now more important than ever that their voices are heard to ensure that they can grow old safely, free from the fear of abuse or harm. And that is what we are aiming to do within the charity. So I would now like to invite our panelists this morning, and we're very fortunate to have a a very esteemed panel with us this morning to introduce themselves briefly before we get on to the main body of the webinar, which is the discussion around the manifesto, our oath pledge, and other key issues for the charity. So if I could maybe begin, and I'm just going across my screen, we're delighted this morning to be joined by one of Hourglass's patrons, Baroness Margaret Ritchie of Downpatrick. And if I could invite you, Baroness, to introduce yourself to the webinar.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Margaret Ritchie. I'm a member of the House of Lords. I'm from Downpatrick in Northern Ireland, and I'm a former Member of Parliament for South Down, former Assembly member, as Sarah would know, a former government minister. I have a particular interest in challenging abuse against older people and the other issues that impact older people that have been, shall we say, put on the shall we say on a heap undealt with, such as care for older people and dementia. And I hope those issues will be addressed by my colleagues in the Labour Manifesto, which has been launched today.
Many thanks, Baroness. And then if I could move to Richard Robinson, who is our Chief Executive Officer in Hourglass. Richard.
Good morning. Yes, my name's Richard. I have been Chief Executive of Hourglass since the end of 2018. We've been through some fairly significant changes during that period of time, including launching our Safer Ageing Week. This is our second manifesto we've written during this period of time. And I'm delighted that so many people are taking an interest in our work and our oath pledge, which we'll be launching today. And look forward to answering any questions you have.
Thanks, Richard. And then if we move across to Nick, and Nick is our External Affairs and Parliamentary Manager. Nick.
Good morning, everybody. As you heard, I'm Nick Kelly. I'm the External Affairs and Parliamentary Manager. So I'm part of the policy unit. So we did a lot of the work preparing this manifesto and have been sort of building this campaign up. So we'll talk about that later during this webinar.
Thanks, Nick. And then if we move to Colin, who is our Community Response Coordinator for Scotland and Northern Ireland. And Colin is also an independent domestic abuse advocate in Scotland. Colin.
Hi there. Yes, I'm Colin. I'm based in Scotland and supporting our frontline work, particularly in Scotland and Northern Ireland, but also with our general frontline services, including our helpline.
Thanks, Colin. Okay, so if we then move on to discuss the key topics of this morning's webinar, and we're going to start with our Hourglass 2024 manifesto, and I'm going to ask our CEO Richard to start off, and I know the other panelists may want to come in after Richard has done an initial intro into the manifesto. Richard.
So I think people on the webinar might think it's odd for a charity to have a manifesto, especially in the midst of such political turmoil with the election, the potential change in government in the UK, but also so much else going on across the four nations. What's happening in politics at the moment isn't just affecting Westminster, it affects all of the nations that we work so closely with. And that's one of the reasons why we chose this time to launch our second manifesto and to actually ask for commitment. So this goes hand in hand with our oath campaign, which I'll talk about in a little bit later in more detail. But effectively, every year, over 2.5 million people are affected by the physical, emotional, economic, or sexual abuse and neglect of older women and men. And it's now reached epidemic proportions and sadly remains so hidden from the headlines. And in lots of ways, launching it on a webinar with people that are already interested in the subject area is actually a a more difficult thing for us to do, because people, the hundreds of people that are already on this webinar already are probably aware of the issue. What we've got to do is to broadcast that issue further to the general public, so it's taken as seriously as other forms of abuse. But the stark reality is that the way society treats and regards older people is a real indictment. It's a real issue. The rise in abuse of older people is also seen as a niche issue. And that's another thing we've really got to challenge as a society, that, you know, the abuse of older people, 2.5, 2.6 million people affected by this, cannot possibly be a niche issue. And yet there still remains no policy for the abuse or violence against older people, in the same way as we create something called violence against women and girls, which is a fantastic strategy, which we fully endorse. But we do believe that the abuse of older people shouldn't be seen as niche. So we need to look at how we can work to rise the public understanding of this unique nature of this horrific level of abuse. And as the only charity that's solely focused UK-wide on confronting this epidemic of harm, neglect, and abuse, we believe it's time for influencers, parliamentarians, and others to embrace the notion of building a safer aging society by 2050. A society where older people can age free from harm, neglect, and abuse, can perhaps live independently. And we realise this is not an overnight project. We realise we need as much understanding as possible, and importantly, parity with other forms of abuse, to make this safer aging society by 2050, which we believe is entirely possible. And I think before I hand over to other people to talk about this, later on this afternoon, my colleague Veronica will be publicising a blog that she's written around what would happen in the event of a population boom of 9 million new babies in society. Now, we're facing a population boom of older people. By 2050, there will be a city the size of London, a new city the size of London of older people. And yet, what preparations are being done to embrace this change? And how would that compare if the governments across the 4 nations were told there was going to be a population boom of babies? What would be built? What infrastructure would be created? So I urge everyone to have a look at that blog later on when it's released, I think lunchtime today. But we need to end this patchwork of provision, the specialist support, which is available in some areas and others, not others, the training, which is available in some areas but not others, and the vital data, which is available in some areas. In Northern Ireland, for example, has fantastic data available from the Northern Ireland Police Service, but it isn't replicated elsewhere. Scotland has a particular issue with this data. So it's becoming a lottery, and the provision is a patchwork. So we now need, as an organisation, to stand together, to work with people who understand these issues, and to build this safer aging society by 2050. And I would really urge everybody who can to log on to our website and take a look at this document, which is our manifesto here. And I'll explain more about the Oath Project later. But so I guess that is Hourglass formally launching its manifesto for 2024. Unfortunately, you can't vote for us, though.
Thanks, Richard. Nick, obviously in your role, would you like to add to?
Yeah, I can add a few points to that. Yeah. So, Richard's going to speak more about the Oath campaign, but the overarching goal is to create a safer aging society where older people are free of abuse and neglect by 2050. The reality is we're not going to be able to achieve in one parliamentary term the end of all abuse, or certainly not all abuse of older people. What we can do is lay down some pretty pretty fundamental foundations and make some pretty important steps to achieve that. And as Richard's already said, the first place you start is by having a strategy in place. We've got something in place for violence against women and girls, and actually that gives us a useful template to actually look at, well, this is what we need for older people. But it needs to have a laser-like focus on what needs to happen to make the UK a safe place to grow old. We do have something of a blueprint document in Wales. It's a start. The other nations we need to go much further. Now, the other challenge, of course, with Wales is a lot of the key areas, such as police and justice, they're actually decided by Westminster, not in Cardiff. So we do need the four nations, and actually, in terms of Westminster, there needs to be an overarching strategy to make the UK a safe place to grow old. That just has to happen. I won't go into every single last thing, but I will give some of the key highlights. So there needs to be legislation change. And I can tell you some of the key points that we'll be looking at in the next Westminster parliamentary term. The Forfeiture Act, which currently means that you can't inherit if you are responsible for killing an older person. That needs to be extended. That needs to be for anyone who commits economic abuse against an older person, you should not be then inheriting. So we need to broaden that. That's a legislation change that has happened overseas, but that has to also be the case here. Powers of entry, which we've had since 2007 in Scotland and since 2014 in Wales. We need that to be in England as well. In Northern Ireland, there is legislation currently going through, adult protection legislation, that will see that happen. So now that the Assembly is back, we want to see that happen quickly. But then the other thing is, it's practical things. Like in the last parliamentary term, we had the Victims and Prisoners Bill. And part of that was a commitment in principle to having specialist older people services. What that commitment did not include is a funding package, and the funding that PCC's Police Crime Commissioners currently get to provide specialist independent advice advocates, that funding runs out in March next year, and we're yet to get any commitment to that. So that needs to happen quite urgently. Pretty much immediately after the election, there needs to be a decision made about that funding. I mean, as I said, we're a four-nation charity, and one of the things that we want to see in Scotland is the broadening of the definition of domestic abuse. The current definition of domestic abuse in Scotland actually excludes the majority of cases of older people because it refers to intimate partner, whereas most of the cases we support involve children or grandchildren. So we need to modernise that definition of abuse. But of course, it's not just about changing the law. The biggest change, and the thing that will make a change, is public awareness. And we know that there's a lot of ignorance. When we did some polling during the pandemic, we found a significant number of people didn't believe that taking inheritance early off an older person was a form of economic abuse. So clearly there's a lot of work to be done about that awareness. And so that's really a lot of what our manifesto asks are about. It's about educating the public. But actually, one of the key tools we need for that is data. And as you heard from Richard, we have some real barriers there. In Scotland, we have not been able to complete our safer aging index that we've been able to do in other nations because the police just do not collect the data on the age of victims. It's absolutely appalling. Other parts of the UK, police have data, but the banding's so wide. You know, in theory, it could be from 75 to 95, which is almost as hopeless. So we really do need data. May not be the sort of sexy, exciting policy issue, but actually, until we have that accurate information, we can't possibly have a strategy that then allows us to put resources where they're needed and to tell that story. So that's got to change. And again, that's the thing that really across the four nations needs to happen. It's particularly, I think, Scotland, but England and Wales have a lot of work to do as well. So I'll leave it there for now, but that's the opening remarks.
Okay, Nick. And just in relation to the remarks that Nick and Richard have made, Colin, have you anything that you would like to add? I suppose particularly in respect of Scotland, where you're covering Scotland and Northern Ireland.
Yes, so just to echo the points that have been made, that you know, in terms of the definition of domestic abuse, and even where in England and Wales and indeed in Northern Ireland, where domestic abuse can include wider relationships other than intimate partner abuse. There still isn't the provision, and Richard has mentioned there that the sort of patchwork of provision. There's we've been really we've led the way on providing IDVAs for that specialise in older people, but that's there's only a handful of those in pockets of mainly the southeast of England. Now that is something that makes a difference, and we need to see that replicated in every PCC area, and beyond. We also, particularly if we're looking at that change to the definition of domestic abuse in Scotland, we could see something similar here, and we could see something similar in Northern Ireland. We just need to get the political will to make that happen, and obviously funding will be crucial to that as well. But the first thing that has to happen around that is recognising the issue, that there needs to be specialist provision, because many older people feel that it doesn't really apply to them, that they are not actually included. And this is, people who we work with, who contacted us, feel that they are, they don't fit the mold for the domestic abuse services, for violence against women and girls services that are out there. So there has to be a culture shift in terms of how we see that, how we define that, and then obviously we have to match that with how we provision the support for older people in that situation. I mean, the same thing would apply with mental health services as well, that many people over 65 just feel that they are not, and in some cases it's fact, they are not being fairly served by mental health services in this country. So there's a lot of work there still to do in terms of culture, and how we adapt our services and our approach to supporting older people. As Richard said, we've got potentially 9 million older people by 2050. At the moment, we're woefully underprepared for that. So how can we change that? And again, Richard will talk more about oath later on. But one of the things that I will be able to do, hopefully, and my colleagues who are delivering local services and local support through our community response service, is we will be out there, in public spaces, promoting the oath and inviting people to sign up. Now, in some ways it may seem like a symbolic thing, but actually it's really inviting people to be part of that conversation, and just raising the profile of that conversation, and inviting people to commit, to say that they actually do believe in that and support that. And ultimately that might drive policy, and it might drive changes in how we deliver services. Okay.
Many thanks for that, Colin. And then if I could come to you, Baroness Ritchie, and I suppose you're in a unique position in that obviously you are a patron of Hourglass, and also your key role as a member of the House of Lords, and just maybe to invite you to share your thoughts and views from what you've heard from Richard, Nick and Colin, and obviously your own views in terms of how we can take forward our sort of, I suppose, vision of creating a safer ageing society by 2050.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everybody. I think it's the aim and objective of everyone to want to create a safer society for older people, and to try to bring about mitigations in terms of elder abuse. And we must be able to have that capacity to inform the public policy debate, particularly during a general election period, and particularly with the potential of a new government coming in after the 4th of July. Ladies and gentlemen, since 2022, I have been a patron for Hourglass I support the aims of Hourglass to end abuse and the neglect of older people. There is no doubt we live in an ageing society. All the statistics are available, where there are now more older people over the age of 65 than ever before. We're not investing in older people's services for preparing for that ageing society. And I think that reference has already been made by Richard and Colin and also by Nick. We see this in health and social care, where successive governments have kicked the can down the road in terms of social care reform. We see it with investment in dementia research, but also in the provision of medicine for dementia, because there's one outstanding piece of medicine that has not yet been fully approved by NICE, which undoubtedly would assist those who are currently suffering from it. And I would also say that where, despite promises to increase funding for dementia research have been made at the last election, this was not followed through with investment. And we see it also with abuse of older people. The current government have made commitments to specialist older people services in the Victims and Prisoners Act, yet funding to the police crime commissioners to provide this specialist support ends next year, and no announcement has been made what happens after this. Obviously an area for investigation, for exploration and resolution in the new parliamentary session with the new government. More broadly, we live in a society which continues to discriminate against older people. Older people are still viewed as unproductive, a burden on society, and not a priority for policymakers. And in an ageing society, this needs to change, because I have found, being a member of the House of Lords, that older people are very productive and they, shall we say, participate in loads of debates, provide amendments, undertake the function of the House of Lords, which is the reviewing and improving institution for legislation and policy. And that's done by and large by people who are a lot older than we are. We saw during the pandemic how older people were treated as expendable. Thousands of older people were discharged from hospital without being tested for coronavirus. Our care homes became COVID hotspots and many lives were needlessly lost. In Northern Ireland, after 2 long years, we finally now have a government in Stormont, which only lasted about 2 years, but prior to that we had 3 years with no government. So on the government's programme includes legislation that will strengthen adult safeguarding and provisions that will help protect vulnerable older adults against abuse. However, at present, legal protections in Northern Ireland remains weak, and I hope that the Northern Ireland Executive and the official opposition will directly address this particular matter. In other parts of the UK, legal protections and services of older people against abuse are patchy and require considerably more investment. And the aim of building a safer ageing society free of abuse and neglect by 2050 is a very noble one. It would be great to get them sooner, but with the challenges we currently face, it will likely take us to 2050 to make real progress. But to achieve this, the work will start today. To conclude, ladies and gentlemen, I see a safer ageing society as one which has specialist services supporting older victim survivors of abuse in every community, and these services would be well funded and signposted by other agencies. Older people would be considered an important part of our society and valued, rather than being neglected and forgotten about as they are at present. Ladies and gentlemen, finally, I would urge everyone to sign up to Hourglass's Older Age Tomorrow's Hope campaign and help us to build a society where it is safe to grow old. Thank you.
Thank you, Baroness Ritchie. Some very, very important messages coming across there. And now we're going to move back to Richard, to our CEO, to officially launch our oath campaign. Richard.
So Older Age, Tomorrow's Hope is a campaign that we would like to ensure that everybody, as many people as possible across the UK, signs and adopts as part of their mantra to work to protect and commit to a safer aging society by 2050. This is not just a paper exercise. This is not something which is just to underline our charity's core approach. It's something that we want to use as a crowbar to get into more meetings, to get in front of more influencers, to ensure that safer aging society becomes part of the parliamentary mantra in the same way as violence against women and girls and other core approaches. We need oath to become something that people commit to in a very serious way. Now, I am absolutely delighted that those early adopters have taken it so much to their hearts, and the messages that we've had out there, even this morning, is fantastic for us as a charity. But signing the oath isn't just about ticking a box on the internet. It's about helping us and other age sector and domestic abuse sector organisations push that agenda forward. It's about fairness, it's about parity, it's a non-political message. Hourglass remains completely non-political in every way possible, but we do want whoever is in Westminster, whoever's in power after the election, to make committing to a safer aging future for the next generation to really take this seriously. Now, I would also say, in terms of oath, is that it's very easy for people to tick a box and move on from looking at something that's tangible. But I would also encourage those people to look at the aims of Hourglass, look at the manifesto, and look at some of the case studies that we're having to deal with on a daily basis, Colin's team particularly. Hourglass deals with the worst kinds of casework around the abuse and neglect of older people. We work very closely with lots of other age organisations, but Hourglass tends to be the go-to for those most significant, most appalling forms of abuse. We need to put a full stop to this. We need to find a way to ensure that every corner of these islands has specialist support to tackle this outrage. And in doing so, to echo what Baroness Ritchie says, not only do we need to ensure that there are funding commitments made very, very quickly, but also to ensure that there is this parity, which you've heard the word parity a lot during this webinar. To give an example of what I'm talking about, there's been mention of the IDFAs and ISFAs, the Independent Domestic Violence Advocates and Independent Sexual Violence Advocates across England and Wales, and a very similar programme in Scotland. When that package of funding came from the Ministry of Justice, one of the things that was absolutely inherent in that was the Ministry of Justice and the PCC's requirement to have a specialist IDFA for children. And we would support that wholeheartedly. We are absolutely working hand in hand with all forms of abuse across the UK. However, we strongly believe there should have also been the same requirements for a specialist provision for older people. And what we'd like to see is, in building this safer aging society, the initial green, the original, the first steps we need to start making are around that increased provision. It's ensuring that people who are suffering, their families don't just have the right protections and the right support services, but also can recover in whatever the way that might mean. So in formally launching Oath and encouraging everybody on this webinar to sign, I would also underline that this is not a yes/no question. I think anybody across these islands wants to create a safer aging society for older people. It's how we stem the epidemic proportions of abuse that runs alongside it.
Thank you, Richard. And thank you to those who have started to submit some questions into the chat function. And as I say, please feel free to put any question that you have, and we will try to address as many of those as we can this morning. And if we happen to get overwhelmed and can't get to address all the questions, we will follow up with you after the webinar. So if we maybe move into the question and answer section, and I'll start, Richard, back with you, because one of the, I'm sure, key things people will be asking themselves is, whilst Oath is calling for safer ageing society by 2015, why will it take 26 years, do you think, to achieve this goal?
Well, there's actually quite a glib answer. I will give it, and that is that Hourglass has been in existence since, well, actually, probably slightly earlier than 1994, 1993, with Sally Greengross, Baroness Greengross, working to build the charity. And it has taken us 30 years to get a position where there is funding for specialist support services, 30 years. So therefore, in setting a target of 2050, not only are we trying to be realistic, to understand the hurdles and the pressures on society, but also to look at some of the other enormous pulls on society to create that ask. Now, I really hope that 2050 is simply a target and that we achieve a safer aging society long, long before this. But with all of the other targets that are in a government's framework around net zero, around how we offer genuine support for business, we need to wrap safer aging into every element of that. So in doing all of this, it's about not just looking at steps towards ending abuse and creating safer aging. It's also about how we make sure that the rights and sort of considerations of older people are wrapped around every element of government across the four nations, not just Westminster, policy and protocol. So 2050 is merely a target, and we hope it's achieved long before then.
Thanks, Richard. Nick, would you like to add anything to Richard's comments?
I mean, I think that covers most of it. I think, as I said earlier, policymakers tend to work in electoral cycles, and we know in a 5-year electoral cycle to achieve something ambitious like ending all abuse is just not going to happen. But we need to reinforce that we need these long-term ambitions, because frankly, it might take 4 or 5 electoral cycles, but actually we need to state it now and put things in place now. And as Richard said, it should be a target. We should be ambitious and hoping that it happens sooner and doing what we can to make that the case. But given what we know, and given how long things take, actually 2050 is actually ambitious.
Okay, thanks, Nick. And Baroness Ritchie, you did reference the target date of 2050 and said earlier that really the work starts now. Anything further to add to Richard and Nick's comments?
Well, they both have very quickly and very fully highlighted the particular issues. I would say there's a potential for us now with an incoming government. And as Nick said, the policy platforms are usually on a 5-yearly cycle to coincide with that of any government. at the time, and Parliament. I think the opportunity is now to get in there with the new Health Secretary and the Health Ministers, both in the Commons and the one that will be in the Lords, to get working on this particular issue.
Thanks for that, Baroness Ritchie. Okay, on to our next question. And for this one, maybe Colin, I'll come to you first. What are the key barriers at this time to ending the abuse and neglect of older people?
So I think the fact that there appears to still be quite a high tolerance as a society for the abuse of older people. I think it's been mentioned already about inheritance, and that a large proportion of people who we've surveyed a few years ago actually don't see taking money or belongings from an older relative as abuse. Now, if that's the case, if that continues to be the case, then that's part of the battle right there. Is that as a society we haven't quite grasped and understood what constitutes abuse of older people, and so there's I think a lot of it comes down to the sort of the pyramid of violence, and that the harm doesn't actually start when somebody throws a punch. It starts when with the sort of microaggressions and the general ageism that might fail within a society, how we actually treat older people by and large, and what we're putting in place. So that's something that obviously there's a whole education and awareness piece that has to happen across the board. But part of that, perhaps in parallel with that, we do need policy changes as well. So things like we've talked there about the safe aging society. That is something that right now could become a standing agenda item in terms of government. So that just as we always the NHS, for example, continues to be in every election continues to be an issue that will be discussed, will be argued about, and the economy obviously will always be a central issue. Safer aging should become part of that package of standing issues that need to be addressed by successive governments, and not just be a kind of party political project, but will actually be a part of the kind of fabric of what it means to be in government in this country. I think those are two of the main issues, and obviously there are a lot of things that be done institutionally, so within agencies and services as well. We can work to promote safer aging and the understanding of how we recognise and respond to abuse, what steps can be taken. That can be at all levels of all organisations, because it is everyone's responsibility, and we all have a part to play in that. So if frontline workers within services are able to recognise, if they are coming into contact regularly with older people, are they able to recognise harm that might be going on? Are they able to spot those signs? And would they know what to do if they do see that, and if they do have those concerns?
Okay, thanks, Colin. Richard, anything that you would like to add to that?
No, I think Colin has answered that really well. No, I think, and also it should point out as well that Colin's on the front line here. So we're really blessed with a really strong frontline services team in Hourglass with that really specialist knowledge. And one thing I would say, and this goes for all those who make contact with Hourglass, whether it's from a community response perspective, whether it's those who are working with our IDFAs or with the helpline team, that it's their specialism and their knowledge is helping to save and change lives. And so therefore and I've also seen a few questions. What initiatives can governments implement to increase awareness of abuse of older people among the general population? Well, you know, how we can underline what services are out there, like Colin's team, like their helpline team, will undoubtedly ensure that more people come forward. One of the big issues we have as an organisation is the fact that we know that there are far more cases under the surface than we're dealing with. How do we encourage more people to come forward? How do we encourage more men, for example, to come forward with specific cases? We have just launched our first ever economic abuse hub in Wales. How do we find funding for more economic abuse hubs in the UK? And how do we make our service fully sustainable to protect Colin's team, the helpline team, and so on? So these are all issues that we need government support in the UK, but likewise from the Assembly in Northern Ireland, from the Senate in Wales, and from the Scottish Government.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Okay, the next question we're going to move on to, because we are getting lots of questions in through the chat function, and thank you for that. And maybe Baroness Ritchie, I'll come to you first on this one. The next Westminster government will face many challenges, and those have been referred to this morning. How can we ensure that the abuse of older people and Hourglass's safer ageing vision are on the policy agenda at this very difficult time?
Thank you for that question, Sarah. And I think Richard and Colin and Nick have already addressed some of this in their contributions. The bottom line is that we have to be ready for a new government coming in on the 5th of July with our manifesto, seeking meetings, not only with the Health Secretary, with those involved in the political administration of social care, but also in social welfare, the whole Department for Work and Pensions, also probably other government departments like Justice. The whole protection of older people should be key, whether it's their bodily protection or protection from people who might abuse them from within the family or from outside the family, and to protect them from any forms of threat of abuse or any forms of violence or anything like that. So I think we have to be in there with our manifesto on day one to influence the agenda. Because as we know, those of us who have been in government before, and because there are competing policy priorities and competing money, and we're dealing with less money now than there was heretofore, and we know that an incoming administration will find that there's not an awful lot there in the coffers, so they will have to manage it very carefully and very sensitively. So the bottom line is we need to be in there influencing the government, influencing parliamentarians, both in the Commons and the Lords, to try to, shall we say, accelerate help for those who are fighting elder abuse and protect older people. And whenever I was speaking, I said, funding to the police crime commissioners to provide the specialist support ends this year, and there has been no announcement what happens after this. So it's always the follow through, and we need that, and we need this on a rolling basis to ensure that policies are implemented and that there is a follow through with the monies. So it's very much on the ledger sheet, the policies, the funding, and the implementation and the dates. And where there hasn't been, that you're going back to the appropriate minister and the officials to pursue that towards implementation. And for my part, I will try with my colleagues in the Labour group to influence things and to be raising things on a continuous basis in the House of Lords.
Thank you, Baroness Ritchie. Okay, we'll move on to the next question, and I'll maybe come to you, Nick, with this one. Saturday, which is the 15th of June, is World Elder Abuse Awareness Day, as we've mentioned. How does the UK compare with other countries on abuse of older people? And are there any lessons we can perhaps learn from elsewhere?
I mean, the frustrating thing is, unfortunately, there's no other country you could put on a pedestal and say, look, this is the way. I think, honestly, if you want to, want to look at what needs to be done, we need to do it ourselves. There are bits around the place. I mentioned before the forfeiture legislation about inheriting money when you've committed abuse. I know that in California they've introduced that legislation. I know there's other programs. I know Australia, they've done a bit of work on awareness raising. There's even some there's some states in the US that have got specific legislation on abuse of older people. Although, again, there's pros and cons to doing that, I think. But again, there's no one place you go, look, that's the model. We have to build the model. And actually, I think one of the things that's part of this is actually in a few years' time, other countries will be looking to the UK and looking at what we've achieved, and probably what we've achieved as a charity and what we've achieved as a country, going, well, that might be the way. But sadly, no, at this point, there's nothing kind of there to look at.
Okay, thanks, Nick. And we'll maybe now move on to some of the questions that are coming in from delegates, either before this morning's webinar or during the course of this morning's webinar. And thank you for that. And we'll do our best in the remaining time to get through as many of those as we can. One that has come in from Gareth: how can larger organisations empower and enable their frontline staff to identify potential elder abuse and to take the appropriate action rather than just assume somebody else will be dealing with it? And maybe, Colin, I'll come to you because you did reference that earlier in the webinar, but it's this issue of ensuring that, as someone else said, I think, I'm not sure who, but it has to become everyone's responsibility, not just assuming there are certain people who have the job of identifying and raising concerns and making appropriate referrals.
Yeah, yes, thank you. So I mean that is correct, that there are, it is everyone's responsibility, and it should be. Obviously there will come a point in the process where professionals will step in and do their role. We have safeguarding legislation in all parts of the UK apart from currently Northern Ireland, where the Adult Protection Bill is currently going through the process and hopefully will become law too long. So there are kind of specialists, there are the professionals, the authorities who will deal with particular aspects of the harm and abuse of older people when it is identified. But I think what we need is rightly is to have early detection, early intervention, people actually being alert to it, knowing the signs to look out for. In actual fact, we at Hourglass do have training that we can provide to all kinds of services in terms of spotting those signs. So, for example, an organisation might want to approach us, as many have in the past, to deliver some training. It's quick, it's simple, but it just arms people with some of that knowledge that they might not have thought of already in terms of how to recognise where there might be abuse going on of an older person. But also we can help them to make sure that they know what to do. Many organisations will have and should have their own internal safeguarding procedures. They will have someone in the organisation who they will report these concerns to. Sometimes though there's a lack of confidence, particularly where it is somebody who's perhaps on the front line and a bit removed from the kind of the institution of the organisation, who perhaps just doesn't have that confidence as to whether this is something that I should report or whether it's actually none of my business. And as we've said, yours business. If we see something that doesn't seem right, if it seems like there's an older person here whose rights are being affected, whose interests are being attacked, or whose economic security or independence is being eroded, that is something that is always worth to someone about who can actually perhaps intervene in that situation.
Okay, thanks, Colin, for that. And we'll move on to another question. And I think, Richard, I'll come to you to start this one. And it's in from Corinda, in terms of what support systems are in place to protect elderly individuals who have disabilities, and that could be a range of disabilities, who have experienced abuse or neglect.
Actually, that's probably one for Colin again, rather than myself, Sarah, because Colin's more likely to know those services on the ground. Is that something you can help me with, Colin?
Well, certainly, where there are support needs such as disabilities, that would be something that generally would fall under the CARE Act and the adult safeguarding provisions within that, sections 42 to 47, I believe, across England certainly, and similarly the Scottish legislation at the moment, the Adult Support Protection Act, takes into account what's known as the 3-point criteria. So if an older person has a disability or some other condition that might make them more susceptible to harm and might also make it harder for them because of that condition to protect themselves, then there is a duty on local authorities to intervene, to make inquiries initially and then investigations. However, the reality on the ground is that that's not always happening, and not every case where there are concerns reported is being followed through to the same extent. And often that is to do with the limitations of resources, whereby the threshold becomes higher for who actually will meet the criteria, who will actually receive the support. It's I suppose it's the same with all services, that they have to make difficult decisions about how they are going to use their limited resources. However, not really a justifiable excuse for not supporting the most at risk and most vulnerable people in our society. And so again, perhaps it goes back to government and how we can increase resources where that harm has occurred, but also again, it's everyone's job to do what we can to prevent it or to intervene earlier so that we don't end up with the crisis, and we can put those other supports in place earlier to prevent that from becoming a case of serious harm.
Okay, thanks, Colin, for that. Our next question, and I'll come to you, Baroness Ritchie, because it's sort of has a legal aspect to it. Paul is asking, do the panel support a specific stand-alone crime of elder abuse? And as we know, in certain other countries, there are these crimes on the statute. And I just wonder if you want to make a comment on whether you think that is something that in the UK we would support.
I think that is an area that should be explored. Whether if it was implemented via legislation, whether it would be fully carried through is another thing. I think the first thing, we have to change hearts and minds, both within government, within Parliament, and within wider society, that elder abuse is wrong, that it impacts on your family, it impacts on your grandparents, it impacts on your parents, and it needs to be challenged. But there has to be probably forms of regulation, because elder abuse could take the form of financial abuse. So we need to see what the banking sector is doing in relation to that. But again, there is need for investment in the whole dementia research and medication provision. There needs to be shall we say, an insurance and assurance that when government bring forward legislation that protects older people, that it actually is followed through with the ledger again with the implementation side, with the funding and with the commitment to do that. I think those are areas where we could help elder abuse. Whether we should make elder abuse a shall we say, should outlaw it. I think we need to fully explore that and see what would the consequences be. Would there be financial consequences? Would there be ripple effects in other areas? I'm not opposed to it by any manner of means, but we have to see what people generally think about it.
Thanks, Baroness. And Richard, a follow-up to that question, if you'd be able to maybe sort of make a comment on it. Do you think that the UK is ready to make certain agencies and individuals mandatory reporters of elder abuse in terms of, you know, almost a statutory duty to report?
I think it's one of those things where we need a far greater investigation into how that would work. I think it's an area where we as a charity are looking at specific policies and briefs ourselves to look at how we can help sort of delineate that, you know, those issues. It's the problem is that, as with Paul's question, that there are a number of routes in undertaking these policies and strategies, and you know, and one of the same reasons as why we've talked about Safer Aging Society by 2050. We want to greatly examine what those routes are to find the appropriate ways of dealing with them before coming up with hard and fast decisions. And I think that's quite probably the right way of doing things. We've seen what's happened when quick decisions have been made without due thought in the last Parliament and the Parliament before. So it would probably be worth taking some informed advice before, you know, having a particular policy on those areas.
Okay, thanks, Richard, for that. And then moving on to a question which is which Jill has sent in, and maybe Colin, because it's very much about frontline practice. I'll come to you first. And Jill is saying we need parity in legislation, and she makes the comparison that there are very clear processes in working together, which obviously is in relation to children, but we don't have the same strong structures for adults who are victims of abuse. And she is citing that they've had a number of cases where older people with unexplained injuries present at emergency departments, and there isn't the process then of how that gets reported seems to vary depending on where you're actually presenting with these unexplained injuries. So I think our point is, you know, why do we not have the same robust processes in place for older people who present with unexplained injuries as we clearly do have for children?
Yeah, it's a good question. And you know, even where organisations are under that responsibility to report, there is always room for professional judgment, which not always correct. You know, and sometimes we will kind of explain something away, or we will ask, you know, sometimes the professional will ask questions if they do see an unexplained injury, and will be satisfied with the false explanation that is given. So it is very difficult. I would say that you know, it is always worth, you know, asking those questions and trying to get more information if there are any things that would concern you as a professional around someone's presentation. So, you know, unexplained bruises or broken bones injuries are sometimes quite an obvious thing that there might be abuse going on. Not necessarily, of course, because with older people, could be other reasons why they have bruises, why they have injuries. But if they are genuinely unexplained, there's no underlying medical condition that might explain why that is. It's certainly worth asking about that. I suppose the difficulty may be that in the case of children, there's more of an onus on others to protect children because children are seen as not having the same level of agency as an adult would. So a child may not be able to fully explain what's going on. They may not be able to fully, they might not have the same resources to reach out for help an adult would. So there, in that sense, there's perhaps more onus on the adult might be experiencing the harm to come forward. However, older adults particularly can be more prone to similar kinds of limitations in the sense that they may not have the resources to reach out for support. They may not have the mental capacity currently. That may be something that's becoming impaired. So recognizing or communicating what is going on might be difficult for an older adult. So I think there are some protocols and procedures in place, and there is some legislation in place that does demand or expect that agencies will work together in these situations, but there it definitely could be improved, and both the policy and the practice, that there's definitely room for improvement on that. For work, health, and police, for example, to have a more integrated approach. There are good examples of it around the country, and there are less good.
Thanks, Colin, for that. And the next question, Nick, maybe come to you and see if you feel you'll be able to make a comment. And it has come in from Tina, who says that the understanding of coercive control, although now law, is still not well understood, and isn't recognised in law well. And she goes on to comment on the economic abuse is also not well embedded in law since the Domestic Abuse Act. And would the panel agree with that comment?
Yes, although I think it goes initially back to the earlier comment about legislation comes second. First, you need public awareness. So if there's not a strong understanding of coercion control, psychological abuse, there's not a strong understanding of what economic abuse is, even if you've got the law in place, it's going to be hard because it's the enforcement that's always the toughest part. I think in terms of, let's say, the Domestic Abuse Act, it did broaden the definition in terms of who can be the perpetrator. It made some steps towards broadening the types of things that could be captured. But again, I mean, it's still only 2 or 3 years in. And one of the things I think, again, earlier question about sort of what we need to do in terms of legislation, one of the things we actually need to do is review existing legislation and review how well it's worked post-legislative scrutiny and look at the number of prosecutions, look at the number of cases where we've managed to prosecute people who've abused older people. That takes time, and given it's only 3 years in, we probably wouldn't have a lot of case studies yet. But I think looking to 2050, that needs to happen. But I mean, certainly in terms of economic abuse, Hourglass are now part of the fraud task force, because one of the things when the government released their fraud strategy, we wrote to the minister and said, look, you need to not just look at cold calling fraud, people taking money off you because of an online fraud or cold call scammers. Actually, a lot of it is, it's coming from family members, and that is another form of fraud, and that also needs to be part of the strategy. And to their credit, the minister and the Home Office took us up on that, and we're now members of that task force, and they're now looking at a pilot after the election, and Devon looking at possible ways that you could tackle that. Coercive control, again, I think the trouble is it's one of those things that's not always easy to capture in legislation easier because it takes various different forms. So actually we need to build that evidence base, we need to build that experience, and actually the legislation comes at the end and it should be evolving as well. It's not, right, here's a quick fix, that'll fix it. As Richard said, actually it's going to be a slow process, and actually if we learn how to tackle it, then in time the legislation should be evolving and catching up. But yeah, the public awareness is the first step.
Richard, do you want to make any comment on that? Or you have
No, I think Nick's answered that fantastically, Sarah.
Okay, thanks. And then we'll move on to another question which has come in from Penelope, and really just to paraphrase, and it's in relation to grandparents not having any automatic right of contact with grandchildren, and theoretically there is a legal process to obtain contact, but obviously, like many legal processes, it be expensive and adversarial, and maybe not achieving the outcome. And it goes on to say that 1 in 7 grandparents are denied contact with grandchildren. And until recently, a parliamentary petition was running on this subject. And perhaps after, Richard, you make a comment, Baroness Ritchie, whether she's aware of that. This lady runs a support group, and become aware of grandparents being subjected to unreasonable demands for money, property, childcare, dependent on the contact with grandchildren being withdrawn. So, I mean, it's something that I know has come up in webinars before. So it is obviously something which is out there and an issue in some places.
I think part of a safer aging society is about building strong, positive relationships with your grandchildren, with your children, and ensuring that is part of a framework of grandparents having, independent living, having that strong family circle. I think. And likewise, we are very supportive of ensuring that older people have their rights respected in terms of not just their access to grandchildren, but all kinds of other rights, free from abuse, free from exploitation. Every case we have, we see has a different element to it, and we have to deal with things on a case-by-case basis. So it'd be very difficult to respond to the grandparent issue from a charity perspective, but we would certainly see that strong relationships with positive, healthy relationships with grandchildren would certainly aid a safer aging society.
Thanks, Richard. And Baroness Ritchie, do you want to make any comment on?
Well, as an add-on, Sarah, from
Yeah.
what Richard has just said, it is important that older people and that grandparents are facilitated in building those strong, loving, durable relationships with their children and with their grandchildren. And it does mean in that respect that it's a two-way process, that they're involved in parenting, grandparenting, and have full access rights, as long as there's no forms of abuse either way. But also, I think bringing in forms of regulation is not always the best thing, because you're forcing things on people, which is not always the best thing. Something like that has to come naturally from the people themselves as part of that kinship with their children, with their grandchildren, and with young people and their parents and grandparents. Maybe it's something to be explored further, but I think we have to be careful in that respect.
Okay, thank you, Baroness Ritchie. And we have a question in, and this definitely is one for you, Colin. What can specialists, independent domestic violence advocates, or independent sexual violence advocates, which is the term that is used obviously in across England, do that more generalized services cannot do?
Yeah, so obviously there are more general independent domestic violence advocates out there, but from our point of view and from the services that we provide, we our IDVAs and ISVAs are specially trained in terms of they bring the understanding of the experience of older people and how that the abuse that they might be experiencing will manifest in different ways and will impact them in different ways. So, for example, it might be things like refuge provision may not be easily accessible for an older person. Perhaps there might be mobility issues that would limit their options in terms of seeking refuge if they are having to flee a domestic abuse situation. There will be other issues as well. For example, it might be that the relationship has been more long-standing, and there are difficulties perhaps in kind of extricating oneself from that relationship. And that is insight that our IDVAs are able to bring, and can have that understanding of some of the difficulties that will affect an older victim survivor that might not into younger victim survivors. One of the other things, of course, to note is that the kind of the gender split of where as victims become older, we find that the gender split is not, obviously it's nowhere near equal between men and women, but it is closer. I think it's something like 30 when it's older victims, as opposed to sort of 90 and 10 for a younger age group. So we are seeing more male victim survivors in the older age groups as well. So that's something that I think, while there are male specialist services out there, again, there's probably not as many. Well, there's definitely not as many. The resources aren't there in the same way. So our services take into account that they may well be supporting a male or a female and providing the same level of support. However, obviously recognizing that there will be differences to how that takes shape. And it is, it is a bespoke service. We do try to tailor the service to the specific individual. And as I say, there may be other support needs that individual has. We may have to liaise with a wider range of services or a different range of services. Social workers, there might be care providers, there might be healthcare needs. They may have more contact with health services. So it's all of these things really that pertain more to older people than to the wider population. Our IDVAs advise on.
Okay, Richard, do you want to?
I think there is a much more general point to make here about specialist IDVAs and ISVAs. I've already made the point that when funding was announced by the Ministry of Justice, there was the mandate or the direction that every police and crime commissioner had to appoint an IDVA for children. And so therefore that specialist provision was required. The same specialist provision was not mandated for older people. And so therefore, as every service should be informed by lived experience, it's really important that specialist service is provided as a specialist need is there. And that's not just about older people, it's about the LGBTQ plus community, it's about male victims, there are, and people with disabilities. We need to ensure that lived experience plays a real part in what services are provided across these islands, and much more importantly, they need to be invested in accordingly.
Okay, that's an important point to make, Richard. And we're coming now towards the end of our questions, but a final one before we just round up with concluding remarks has come in from Gillian. And fortunately, Colin, I'm going to have to come back to you because it is about experience, I suppose, on the front line, and that is there's a concern that police are reluctant to fully investigate serious instances of abuse, even when presented with evidence. Would you like to comment on that, or from experience from frontline services? Is that something that...
I mean, I think the experience of police involvement and engagement in these cases is varied. You know, and there are we have cases where there's very kind of proactive policing. There's some of our residents, for example, have really good, strong working relationships with the police, and find that that investigations are full and thorough, and that cases can go to court and brought to justice. But unfortunately, that is not a universal experience. And again, it will vary between police forces. It will vary even down to individual officers and how they will respond to situations. Obviously, there are policies and procedures that officers will be expected to follow, but the implementation of those, the interpretation of those may vary. So, yeah, it's definitely it is a mixed bag.
Yeah, and I suppose a follow-up question to that is, because of delays, which obviously caused significant distress, how can, or what should be done, I suppose, to ensure that the most serious cases of abuse and neglect are prioritised?
So, I mean, all I can say really on that is that the risk assessments are carried out on in each case using the ASH RIC or something similar, which will help to categorize and prioritize the level of risk. So higher risk cases will be discussed at multi-agency risk assessment conferences, where various agencies will sit around the table and look at what they know and what they can each do, and they will each take responsibilities to guide. Now, obviously, that this is only in cases where they would class as domestic abuse, but there are processes out there that do allow for the prioritization of those higher risk cases, and that's often based on of homicide or of suicide.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Colin, for that. And I suppose as we're coming towards the end of this morning's webinar, I'm going to give each of the panelists a few minutes, really just to make any concluding remarks that they would like to make, but really to address, I suppose, the question, why should people sign up to oath? And Baroness Ritchie, if I could come to you first.
Dear. And first of all, in concluding, I think it is vitally important that people should sign up to oath, because it shows their individual and personal commitment to ending and mitigating the abuse of older people and against elder abuse. For my part, I will also, on the return to the House of Lords after the 9th of July, will be pursuing all these particular issues by way of ensuring that the new government has legislation, has policies that meet the requirements of older people in all the various facets, but above all, that mitigate the impact of elder abuse, because it impacts on all our families, on all our communities, right throughout the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Baroness Ritchie. Nick, if I come to you.
I think where we are now with abuse of older people, you look back 30, 40 years ago, that's where we were with abuse of children. We've made that journey, but we now need to build a movement to end abuse of older people. So that's why everyone should be signing oath.
Thanks, Nick. And Colin, if I could come to you in terms of why people should sign up to oath.
Yep, absolutely. So as we've already said, safer aging and protecting for people is everyone's business. So this is everyone's opportunity to sign up and play their part in working towards a safer aging society. So yeah, that's, the thing is, we all probably know older people. We all have older people in our lives, most of us will. And most of us hopefully will at some stage become older people ourselves. And the work that we do today will impact all of us tomorrow.
Thanks, Colin. And finally, Richard, if I could come across to you for your concluding remarks and your comment on encouraging, obviously, people to pledge the oath.
Great. Well, my concluding remarks are really just a huge thanks to everybody that's joined the webinar today, everybody that's already signed or taken the oath. I also, because we don't have much time left on the webinar, I also wanted to thank Baroness Margaret Ritchie and our other patrons for the work they do behind the scenes for the charity. We are immensely grateful that compared to where the charity was just a few short years ago, we're able now to get questions asked in all 4 houses, 5 houses, of course, in total. And that for the reputational growth, not just within Hourglass, but also within the subject area of the abuse and neglect and harm of older people. And that really underlines why my response to why should everybody sign the oath? Well, why wouldn't anybody want to create a safer aging future for their loved ones, for themselves, and to ensure that people can enjoy the same freedoms and safety and independent life that they had in the earlier stages of their life? I'm not one for Americanisms, but it's a no-brainer. It is time for us to look at how we can protect and enhance a society for older people, and supporting Hourglass, signing the oath and supporting our manifesto is just one obvious way of doing so.
Thanks, Richard. And just reminded myself, a question came in from Joe, one of our trustees, to ask, would there be a template letter with links to the manifesto and the oath? Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, we are doing this quite sensitively, and of course, we are currently working to send the manifesto and the oath sign-up request to almost 4,000 candidates running in this election, as well as of hundreds of other targets, including third sector, corporate, statutory, etc., and of course the general public. So the charity needs to make the first approach to these candidates in a really coordinated and targeted way. Now, sadly, many hopeful MPs and parliamentarians will have never heard of Hourglass, and this is a really busy time for them. So that first introduction to the charity is crucial. Now, once that election outcome is known and Hourglass has at least had the opportunity to make an approach and ask, the charity will engage all of its supporters to ask them to act and to get people to sign up locally. So we are asking those who sign up to oath to pledge and create change, ensure parity, collaborate, influence and build consensus, and be community champions. So I really appreciate Joe's question, really appreciate it. And it's actually a really solid question to ask, but let's ensure that there's that first ask before we open the floodgates.
Okay, thank you, Richard. And then just in concluding, I would, as chair, like to add my thanks to all of the panelists this morning and the delegates, and a special thank you to Baroness Ritchie, who has joined us at a very busy and I'm sure hectic time in the run-up to the general election, and we're delighted that she's made the time as our patron to join us this morning's webinar. Just a few final comments. Can I remind everyone that you will be receiving a short survey valuation, and we really would appreciate if you would take the time to complete that for us. And along with that, Naeem will be sending out the link to the oath, and I think he has put it up in the chat function already, and a link to our manifesto. So that will be available. And a reminder that the recording of this webinar will be sent to everyone who is registered and will be available on the Hourglass Knowledge Bank in the forthcoming days. And please do share it with colleagues, friends, family who maybe haven't been able to join us this morning on the webinar, because we need everyone to raise awareness and to spread the word of the vision of Hourglass. So thank you everyone for taking the time to join us this morning, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.